What if it's the muscles that you train the least that are the ones that are limiting you and holding you back from feeling strong and capable in the gym? In this video, you'll learn the 5 main muscle groups that your main lifts don't touch, and you'll see by adding a few targeted drills, you'll make your training much more complete. The question is, which of these strength gaps is showing up in your training without you realizing? Traditional strength training is awesome. It builds a body that is more resilient and robust. But the traditional exercises like your squats, your hinges, your lunges, your upper body pushes and your pulls, as much as they cover a lot of your main movement bases, there's often areas they don't touch. And when people start adding in accessory exercises, these are usually driven by vanity, by doing things like ab training and arm training, rather than thinking about making your body more capable. So let's break down the 5 main areas that you're probably not training sufficiently to make your workouts feel more complete.
Number 1 is hip flexors, or more specifically, active hip flexion. Hip flexion usually occurs passively during exercises like your RDLs and your squat variations. And when most people think of doing work specifically for the hip flexors, it usually always centers around some kind of hip flexor stretch. But it's really common for people to say the hip flexors always feel tight. And maybe that tightness isn't because of overtension, maybe it's because the hip flexors are weak, they're overworking, and they're not in a great position to actually generate force optimally. And often this issue stems from the fact the pelvis is tipped forward into a slight anterior tilt, and then you're doing your squats, your RDLs, whilst in the anterior tilt. So rather than just ignoring your hip flexors or always stretching them, why don't we think about actually strengthening them? So to start with, I'd choose an isometric exercise that strengthens the hips by having an active hold. Something like a psoas march, where you lie back into a dead bug position with a band around the feet. One hip has to hold still while the other leg fully extends out into hip extension. So you're training the hip on the knee that stays completely static, and you can alternate left side to right side. Another great exercise is this oblique angle isometric hold. You can start this on body weight, then over time progress to using a kettlebell to load it. Another classic exercise is the L-sit tuck. L-sits are a great exercise. The key here is to make sure that the knee comes above the line of the pelvis, because that's going to put the pelvis into a posterior tilt whilst in that position, which orientates you out of the anterior tilt, which can be one of the issues with hip flexor tightness. From there, we can move to range of motion based hip flexion exercises. That oblique position hold is a good place to start this. One of the challenges is though, the kettlebell will strike the floor, which will limit the full range of motion. A simple workaround for that is to elevate your start point so the kettlebell can now clear the ground. Once again, really important to pull that knee all the way through so the knee comes above the hip and we get that posterior tilt of the pelvis at the top, and we can train through that full range of motion. Another great example of a hip flex exercise that you probably already know is a hanging knee raise. Most people think of a knee raise as a core exercise, but it's actually a hip flexion based movement. As much as the abs are working to stabilize the spine, the entire movement comes from the hip flexor group. Number 2 is trunk rotation. I know what you're thinking, but I actually do rotation anyway, but do you really? A classic rotation drill is something like a Russian twist, but let's be honest, most people just move their arms to the side with minimal actual ribcage rotation. Another common exercise is something like a Pallof press, but this resists rotation, doesn't actually train you through rotation. So to truly train spinal rotation, the hips either need to stay still and then the ribcage move, so we disassociate the ribcage from the pelvis, or the ribcage and pelvis would need to oppose one another to get counter movement. Without that, you're not truly training spinal rotation. So one of my favorite exercises for this is a chop variation. I like this in a kneeling position, so you can squeeze the glutes and hold the pelvis nice and still. And then from there, I can focus on keeping the hips forward, turning my ribcage with the weight, and then turning it away as I rotate. And you can see clearly here by doing this, my pelvis stays still, I'm able to train true trunk rotation. This also works really well loaded with a band or a cable. Another great rotation drill is the landmine rotation. Once again, be careful not to turn the hips and the rib cage together. I like a slightly wider base, knees bent to hold those hips still, and then from there I can rotate my rib cage whilst keeping my pelvis nice and fixed. If you go back to the example of the Russian twist, of course we can actually make this true spinal rotation by getting the hips to oppose the rib cage. If I'm picking between exercises that I'm going to program for my clients, I'm going to be choosing between a chop variation and a landmine rotation variation. Number 3 is shoulder stability. First of all, a lot of people's shoulder exercises in the gym are very fixed. barbell shoulder press or machine-based shoulder press. This doesn't really offer any shoulder stability for the joint itself. Next, the shoulder joint is quite complex. It's a delicate interplay between the shoulder blade, the rib cage, and the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint, which makes it easy for the shoulder to be out of position. It's not uncommon to hear coaches talk about centering the shoulder joint. So that is simply making sure the shoulders are set so the head of the shoulder sits beneath the ear and we're not in a full position or an elevated position. Pair that the shoulders and the arms exist in this sort of open chain, unlike the lower body where we're on them all the time, tension going through them, and we regularly transfer weight from one leg to the other, training a little bit of lower body stability. That naturally just doesn't happen with the upper body, so I would suggest having supplementary shoulder stability exercises in your workout. And my favorite way to train shoulder stability is using a kettlebell in this bottoms up position, holding the handle. So from there, your wrist, your forearm, your bicep, and your shoulder have to stabilize the joint. As I mentioned, we want to make sure we center the shoulder, and then from there, you could simply just do a hold. You could articulate the joint out from side to side, or you can add a wrist rotation. That isn't altering shoulder rotation, it is just rotating the forearm, but it gets you thinking about something different whilst trying to hold the shoulder still. You can also do things like carries, holding a kettlebell in the bottoms up position whilst walking or marching. I also really love these line shoulder rotations. For this one, I like to imagine I'm pushing the kettlebell up towards the ceiling whilst going through a full internal and external rotation. And depending on how advanced you are, you can also take this kettlebell bottoms up position into something like a Turkish get-up. Number 4 is to train a plantar surface of the foot. Now let's be honest, have you ever actually thought about training your feet? Most people think of lower limb training as the calves and then don't go any further than there. But your feet are how we transmit force into the ground. So improving the intrinsic strength of the foot and stiffness of their tendons around the foot helps transfer force to the ground better. Some of my favorite exercises are landing drills where you simply step off a box, then focus on sticking the landing. If you watch closely, as I descend down towards the floor off the box, I point my toes towards my knees so I land on my midfoot. That helps to train for this stiffness and to transmit force properly into the ground. Also doing things like non-counter movement jumps where you squat down, pause, explode up and then stick the landing. Progressing to counter movement jumps where you rapidly decelerate down and then explode up and also stick the landing. But without doubt, the best exercises to train the feet and to transmit force into the ground are plyometrics. Alternating pogos and split stance pogos into your workout is a great way to properly train the foot and ankle. Another great way to train the midfoot is doing some sort of floating heel variation to your single leg exercises. For this, you shift the weight onto the forefoot, so this front foot now is not fully stabilized with the arch on the floor passively. Now you have to actually stiffen that foot up to stabilize. And then from there, you can train through your usual split squats patterns, working up to more challenging variations like the rear foot elevated, and you can eventually get to the point that you can load these. That floating heel also works nicely in lunge variations like a reverse lunge. And if you're really up for a challenge with this one, you can do step ups as well as single leg squats. Number 5 is breathing mechanics and core strength. I know what you're thinking, Andy, I do loads of core work, I can skip this bit. But do core work thinking about the position of the rib cage and how your breathing mechanics are actually working. Most people's idea of a core workout is doing some sort of brutal circuit with ab crunches, with no emphasis on movement quality or proper breathing mechanics. And often the problem here is people hold their breath throughout the whole thing, or they actually end up training with their spine in an overextended position, which dumps you into a really big rib cage flare, and a lot of your core bracing comes from the diaphragm, not your intrinsic core muscles. So we want to train our core while keeping that rib cage down. Exhale through your mouth, pack that rib cage down, a little tailbone tuck so you bring the belt line towards the belly button and the rib cage towards the belly button. You'll often hear coaches term this as the canister. And then the key is to maintain that intra-abdominal pressure whilst you do your core exercises, but also maintain a nice rhythmic breath with no breath holds. My favorite place to start working on this is doing a pullover. So this one, you lie on your back, you exhale, press that rib cage down, knees up at 90 degrees, and then you reach the arms overhead. The aim here is to reference your lower back against the ground. You're not trying to crush your back into the ground here, just a soft press into the floor, then reach those arms overhead. You'll notice as the arms reach further and further over your ears, that your ribcage you want to flare more, so you're trying to control the desired ribcage flare. Over time, you can add weight to this one, but be really cautious about adding too much weight because it might promote more of that ribcage flare. We can then progress these to hollow holds, I would suggest to start in this short lever position before progressing to the long lever position. Dead bugs and loaded dead bugs also suit this training method really nicely, and you can also progress to doing things like hanging hollow holds. But remember, the key to all of these is to keep that rib cage down, and you're trying to promote full breathing throughout.
Now let's discuss how to select the right muscle groups for you. We have active hip flexion, spinal rotation, shoulder stability, the plantar surface of the foot, and controlling a ribcage flare. But let's face it, most people are time poor and haven't got all day to train all of those muscle groups. So let's think about your overall requirements and what your training program might be lacking. If you regularly incorporate running into your weekly program, then you're probably going to think more about the plantar surface of the foot and the hip flexion as your primary things to support this. If you have a history of back pain, then it makes more sense to focus on spinal rotation and that ribcage flare. Or if you have a pre-existing history with shoulder injuries, then it makes more sense to do shoulder stability and trunk rotation. It's also worthwhile thinking about what of these movements your training program might already cover. Potentially you could have a rotation-based core exercise in your workout already, and let's say you're doing something like a landmine shoulder press, then there's a decent amount of shoulder stability in that exercise. So maybe your emphasis should go elsewhere so you're not doubling up on particular exercises. Now that you've identified your own specific priorities, let's talk about where these exercises should sit in your workout. Each of the exercises that I've covered in this video so far are what we call accessory movements, and they would be positioned either at the very start of the workout, almost like a warm-up and prep for the session, or at the very end of the workout, because as much as you're going to be really fatigued from the overall workout, none of the exercises that I discuss are massively taxing, so it's not going to make a huge difference if you come to them quite tired. Potentially you could use these exercises as filler exercises and do them in your rest periods, but generally I think it's smarter to put them at either the start or the very end of the session. Training trends to be aware of. When I look around the gym floor these days, a lot of people's workouts look a bit like a pseudo bodybuilding style workout or a powerlifting workout, or some kind of hybrid themed session like a CrossFit or High Rocks workout. And often these sessions end up focusing on wearing your body out rather than really building it up. But by training smart and adding in some of the exercise that I've shown you in this video, you can build a more resilient body and reduce your injury risk over time. If you want more breakdowns to take the guesswork out of training so you can start to understand your body properly, then make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.